Thought I moved back to the edge of Blackwood Basin after the worst year of my life, thinking that the deep, silent woods of Maine would be the only place left on Earth that didn't and oppose. To demand an explanation for my grief. You see, people talk about loss like it's a phase you pass through like a flu or a bad season, but when I lost Elena and our little boy Leo in that highway pileup, time didn't and oppose. T heal a damn thing. It just turned into a long, empty hallway. I didn't and oppose. T wants sympathy. I didn't and oppose. T want in quote. Checking in quote. Calls. I just wanted the kind of silence that lets you hear your own heartbeat. So I packed a single duffel bag, grabbed the keys to my late Uncle Silas's cabin, and drove until the pavement turned to gravel and the gravel turned to pine needles. Silas was a bit of a legend in the Department of Water Resources, a man who understood the mechanics of the earth better than he understood people. And when he died, he left me 300 acres of rugged basin and a private lake that felt like it belonged to another century. It was mine legally, historically, and emotionally, or at least that's what I thought before the Silver Creek Homeowners Association decided that my sanctuary was actually their new playground. The first sign of trouble didn't and oppose. T come with a bang, but with a piece of paper, a crisp, white envelope tucked in my mailbox down by the county road, looking completely out of place against the mud and moss. It was and quote, notice of community integration and quote, from a Silver Creek HOA, a group of suburbanites in a development 3 miles down the road who apparently decided that their borders were more like suggestions than legal realities. The letter, signed by a woman named Regina Thorne, informed me that my lake had been, in quote, voluntarily designated as a shared recreational amenity, in quote, to support a new private investment project, and I remember staring at that word, voluntarily, and wondering if I'd had a stroke and forgotten signing away my family's legacy. It was corporate speak for a land grab, wrapped in a bow of, end quote, community spirit, end quote, but I just tossed it into the wood stove, watching the flames lick the edges of Regina's signature, thinking it was just some clerical error that would blow over. But then the engine started. 2 weeks later, I was sitting on my dock with a lukewarm coffee, watching the mist rise off the water, when a massive pontoon boat came drifting into the center of the basin, carrying 3 men in expensive outdoor gear who were pointing at my shoreline like they were discovering a new continent. I shouted from the dock, telling them they were trespassing on private property, but they just waved back with these practiced customer service smiles, one of them shouting something about, in quote, preliminary surveying, in quote, before they started dropping weighted markers into the depths. By the next morning, my southern bank, the place where Leo had caught his first sunfish, was littered with orange surveyor flags and a laminated sign zip-tied to an ancient willow tree that read, future site of the glass anchor, a floating culinary experience. I felt this cold, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my chest, the kind of professional focus I hadn't felt since I retired from civil engineering, and I knew right then that I wasn't in oppose. T just dealing with a misunderstanding, I was dealing with a predator. I drove into the county seat that afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the knuckles were white, and I spent 4 hours in the basement of the records office with a clerk who looked like she'd seen it all. She pulled up the digital maps, checked the 1968 deed, and then the 1984 hydrological amendment Silas had filed, and she just shook her head, telling me, in quote, Mr. Sterling, they're ISN and oppose. A single easement, a single shared right, or a single HOA boundary that touches your water. You're the king of that basin. End quote. I left there feeling validated, but that feeling evaporated the moment I pulled back onto my property and saw a flatbed truck unloading steel framing onto a modular barge they'd snuck in through an old logging trail on the ridge. I called the local sheriff, a guy named Miller who I'd gone to school with, and when he showed up, he looked at my deeds, then looked at the construction crew, and just sighed into his radio. End quote. Look, Arthur, end quote. He told me, end quote, I see the papers, but these guys have a permit issued by the HOA's legal firm claiming and oppose, customary use and oppose, based on some old hiking trail. I can't stop them until a judge tells me to, and that's going to take months in the system. End quote. That was the moment the grief turned into something else, something harder, something focused. That night, I didn't in oppose, sleep. I went down to the tool shed, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, and pulled back the rusted iron hatch buried under a layer of pine straw behind the cabin. My uncle Silas hadn't into oppos. T just bought this land because it was pretty. He bought it because he'd engineered the entire water table in this county, and this lake was actually a sophisticated private retention reservoir. I climbed down the ladder into the concrete vault, the air smelling of cold iron and wet stone, and there it was, the massive hand-forged gate valve that controlled the outflow into a deep, underground spillway Silas had built to prevent flooding in the 70s. I ran my hand over the wheel, feeling the grit of decades, and I realized that while Regina Thorne and her board thought they were building a monument to their own status in the middle of my lake, they had forgotten one very simple rule. You don and oppos. T build a house on a foundation you don and oppos. T control. The next few weeks were a slow-motion nightmare. The end quote, glass anchor end quote, rose out of the water like a glittering parasite, a massive, two-story modular building sitting on a high-tech flotation system, complete with wraparound decks, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a kitchen that I could hear humming from my porch. They weren't into oppos. T just building a restaurant. They were building a statement. I tried the end quote. Right end quote. Way one last time, walking into the HOA's monthly board meeting in a sterile glass-walled community center, clutching my blueprints like a shield. Regina Thorne sat at the head of the table, looking like she'd been born in that designer blazer. And when I told her the lake was private and the construction was illegal, she just gave me this look of profound, patronizing pity. End quote, Mr. Sterling, end quote. She said, her voice dripping with that fake, suburban honey, end quote. We understand you're going through a difficult time, but we have an oppos, visual easement in oppos, rights, and the community has decided that you're into oppos. Underutilized in oppos, space is better served as a center for local commerce. It's about progress, and frankly, you can't stop the tide. End quote. The room erupted in applause from the 30 or so residents who were already dreaming of sunset cocktails on my water. And as I walked out, one of the younger board members leaned over and whispered, end quote, go back to your shack, old man. The world's moved on. End quote. That was the match in the powder keg. I went home, sat on my porch, and watched as they began tethering the restaurant to my bluff, actually drilling massive steel anchors directly into the granite of my shoreline to keep their, end quote, culinary experience, end quote, from drifting. They were literally bolting themselves to my heart. I pulled out Silas's old engineering logs, found the flow rate calculations for the spillway, and I started doing the math, realizing that if I opened that gate valve just enough, the water would into oppos. T just drop, it would vanish. The end quote, VIP soft launch, end quote, was scheduled for a Friday night in late August, a humid, heavy evening where the air felt like it was waiting for a storm. I watched from the trees as the golf carts lined up, carrying the local elite in their linen shirts and summer dresses, stepping onto the floating deck with glasses of champagne in hand. There was jazz music spilling across the water, laughter that sounded like breaking glass, and Regina Thorne standing on the upper deck giving a toast about, end quote, vision, end quote, and, end quote, new beginnings, end quote. I waited until 11 p.m., until the last guest had wobbled back to their car, and only a small cleaning crew remained on the platform. I walked down to the vault, the flashlight tucked under my arm, and I gripped the iron wheel of the gate valve. It took everything I had, every ounce of my weight, and every bit of the rage I'd been carrying for a year. But the wheel groaned, the rust snapped, and then I felt it, a deep, rhythmic thrum in the ground beneath my boots as the lake began to exhale. I didn't oppos. T just open it. I set it to A, end quote. Controlled collapse, end quote. Rate, an inch every 20 minutes, a slow-motion disaster that wouldn't into oppos. T be visible in the dark, but would be irreversible by dawn. I spent the night on my porch, drinking a glass of Silas's old rye whiskey and listening to the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, the sound of the shoreline expanding. Around 3 a.m., the first groan echoed across the basin. It was the sound of a $3 million floating building realizing it was no longer floating. Because you see, a modular restaurant designed for deep water doesn't into oppos. T handle a mud flat very well. And as the water receded, the platform began to tilt, caught on the uneven boulders of the lake bed that Silas had placed there 50 years ago. By 5 a.m., the end quote, glass anchor end quote, wasn't Apo's a culinary experience anymore. It was a twisted, glass and steel wreck leaning at a 40-degree angle into the muck, its expensive kitchen equipment sliding through the windows and its decorative fairy lights flickering as the electrical line snapped. I sent the email at 6 a.m., CCNG the HOA board, the county zoning office, and the local news station, with a subject line that simply read, end quote, urgent maintenance update for private retention reservoir, end quote. I included the 1982 hydrological filing that gave the owner the absolute right to drain the basin for, end quote, infrastructure integrity, end quote. And I attached a photo I'd just taken to the restaurant, now looking like a beached whale in a sea of gray silt. By 8 a.m., Regina Thorne was standing on my gravel drive, her expensive heels sinking into the mud, screaming at me about, end quote, malicious destruction, end quote, and, end quote, community endangerment, end quote. But I just leaned against my porch railing and smiled, end quote. I told you, Regina, end quote. I said, my voice calm and steady for the first time in a year, end quote. You can't stop the tide, though in this case, the tide's going the wrong way for you, end quote. The aftermath was a glorious legal bloodbath. Since they had built without a single valid county permit on land, they didn't in Apo's. Tion, their insurance company, laughed them out of the office, citing, end quote, unauthorized construction in a high-risk drainage zone, end quote. The HOA was hit with environmental fines for the fuel and debris that leaked into the basin, and the, end quote, glass anchor, end quote. Investors immediately sued Regina and the board for misrepresenting the land rights. It took 6 months, but the board was eventually dissolved. Regina had to sell her house to cover the personal liability judgments, and the new, smaller neighborhood council sent me a formal letter of apology, along with a signed document acknowledging the basin as a, end quote, permanently protected private reserve, end quote. The lake is full again now. I closed the valve once the wreckage was cleared away, and the autumn rains did the rest of the work. It's quiet again, the way Elena and Leo would have liked it, and sometimes when the sun is hitting the water just right, I can almost see the two of them out there in the old rowboat. I didn't in Apo's do it for the money, and I didn't in Apo's do it just to be a jerk. I did it because some things in this world aren't in Apo's for sale, and some silences are worth fighting for. But hey, I'm just one guy with a wrench and a grudge, right? It makes me wonder, though, how many of you out there are dealing with a, end quote, Regina Thorne, end quote, in your own life, someone who thinks your boundaries are just suggestions because they have a louder voice or a bigger bank account. Would you have turned that wheel, knowing it would destroy a $3 million dream to save your own piece of earth? Or is there a point where, end quote, community, end quote, actually means something more than just taking what ISN and Apo's to yours? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I went too far or if you'd have opened that valve even wider. I'm curious to see where you draw the line in the mud.